The music stopped the moment Alistair rose from his chair and lifted his glass. Every eye in the ballroom turned to him. Alina stood near the window, her hand tightening around the stem of her own glass, sensing something was wrong before he even spoke. Alistair announced, in a voice loud enough for every guest to hear, that he would be leaving the country within the week, and that Camille Rousset would be traveling with him. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Alina felt her face grow hot, but she did not let her composure break. She had heard whispers about Camille for months, but she never imagined her husband would humiliate her so openly, in front of the very people whose respect had taken her years to earn. Camille stood beside Alistair, smiling as though she had won a prize rather than stolen a husband. She wore a necklace Alina recognized instantly, a piece that had belonged to Alistair's late mother, passed down through generations of the family. Seeing it around another woman's neck cut deeper than any spoken insult could. Alina set her glass down carefully on a passing tray and walked toward her husband, her steps steady despite the storm inside her. She asked him quietly, so only he could hear, whether he understood what he was throwing away. Alistair barely looked at her. He said the estate would run fine without him for a while, and that Alina was more than capable of managing things in his absence. He said it as though he were speaking of a business matter, not a marriage. Guests began to whisper behind gloved hands. Some looked at Alina with pity, others with poorly hidden amusement. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Instead, she turned to the small orchestra and asked them to continue playing as if nothing had happened at all. The music resumed, awkward and thin at first, then steadier, filling the silence that Alistair's words had left behind. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the candles had burned low, Alina sat alone in the study that had once belonged to Alistair's father. She opened the ledger books, something she had never been permitted to touch before, and began reading through columns of numbers that told a story far more troubling than gossip ever could. Unpaid debts, loans against the estate, money moved quietly into accounts she did not recognize. By morning, Alistair and Camille were gone, their carriage already rolling toward the coast. Alina stood at the window of the manor, watching the empty drive where the carriage wheels had left their marks in the frost. She did not weep. Instead, she felt something colder and sharper settle inside her, a quiet determination that surprised even herself. She was done waiting to be chosen. If Alistair wanted to abandon his home for a woman who wore his mother's jewels like a trophy, then Alina would decide, for the first time in her marriage, exactly what kind of woman she intended to become. The house was hers to protect now, whether he returned or not. Word of the scandal spread through the county faster than the frost could melt from the fields, and Alina understood that everything from this moment forward would be different. The staff gathered the following morning, uncertain who was truly in charge. Alina walked into the main hall, straightened her shoulders, and gave her first order as the true mistress of the house. There would be no more waiting for instructions from a man who was no longer there to give them. Alina sat down at the great desk that had always been forbidden to her, opened the first ledger, and began to read. She did not yet know how deep the trouble ran, but she intended to find out, no matter what it cost her. A stack of unpaid bills nearly toppled off the desk when Alina pulled open the bottom drawer, and her stomach turned as she realized the estate owed money to nearly every merchant in the county. Alistair had borrowed against the land itself, against the very fields that fed the tenants who depended on him. Alina pressed her palm flat against the desk and forced herself to breathe. Panic would not fix this. Only action could. She called for Julian Hale, the estate steward who had served the family faithfully for over a decade. Julian arrived within the hour, his expression grave when he saw the ledgers spread across the desk. He admitted he had suspected trouble for months, but had never been given permission to speak plainly to the Duke. Alina told him that things were different now. She wanted the truth, all of it, and she wanted a plan to fix what had been broken. Together they visited the tenant farms, many of which had fallen into disrepair while Alistair pursued his romance abroad. Roofs leaked, fences had collapsed, and families who once trusted the Whitmore name now spoke of leaving for better-managed estates nearby. Eleanor listened to every complaint without flinching. She promised repairs, and unlike her husband's empty words, she meant to keep her promise. Selling a small piece of unused land at the edge of the property gave Eleanor the funds to begin repairs immediately. Julian helped her negotiate with creditors, buying time by showing them her commitment rather than empty apologies. Slowly, the tenants began to notice the difference. New thatch appeared on rooftops. Broken fences were mended. A doctor was brought in for a family whose child had been ill for weeks with no one to help them. Meanwhile, letters arrived from the continent, forwarded through Alastair's solicitor rather than sent directly, as if he could not be bothered to write to her himself. The letters spoke of parties, of grand cities, of Camille's delight in her new surroundings. There was no mention of the estate, no question about how Eleanor was managing, no acknowledgement of the mess he had left behind. Eleanor read each letter once, then placed them in a drawer she rarely opened again. She had no time for a husband who had already made his choice. Her days were filled with meetings, repairs, and long hours reviewing accounts long into the night. Slowly, something shifted in how the staff and tenants looked at her. Where once they had seen only the Duke's quiet wife, they now saw a woman making real decisions, solving real problems, standing in rooms where she had once been told to remain silent. By the time autumn arrived, the worst of the debts had been settled, and the farms were producing again. Eleanor stood in the fields one evening, watching workers gather the last of the harvest, and felt something she had not expected to feel so soon after her husband's betrayal. She felt proud, not of him but of herself, and of what she had built from the wreckage he left behind. Word of her success began to travel beyond the estate, reaching ears in London that would soon reach Alastair himself, though he was far too distracted to notice yet. The door of the rented villa slammed so hard that a vase toppled from its shelf and shattered across the marble floor. Camille stood with her arms crossed, her voice sharp as she told Alastair that she was tired of waiting for money that never arrived. The allowance he had promised her had shrunk month after month, and the fine dresses she once wore had been replaced by older gowns mended at the seams. Alastair tried to explain that his accounts in England were tied up, that patience was all he asked for, but Camille had run out of patience long ago. That same week, a wealthy merchant from Vienna had begun calling on Camille, sending flowers and jewels far grander than anything Alastair could still afford. She did not hide her interest, and Alastair, watching from across crowded rooms, felt for the first time a flicker of the humiliation he had once caused his own wife. The irony was not lost on him, though his pride refused to let him admit it fully. Within days, Camille packed her belongings while Alastair was away meeting with a banker who refused to extend him further credit. When he returned to the villa, he found only a short note on the table, informing him that she had accepted the merchant's offer to travel with him to Vienna, and that she wished Alastair well in whatever remained of his fortune. The note carried no warmth, no apology, only the cold practicality of a woman moving toward a better opportunity. Alone in the empty villa, Alastair felt the walls close in around him. He had spent nearly everything chasing a life with Camille, and now he had neither the woman nor the money to show for it. He wrote to his solicitor requesting funds, only to receive a reply explaining that most of the estate's recent income had been redirected by the new management at home, a management he did not yet realize was his own wife. Confused and increasingly desperate, Alastair traveled to London to meet with the solicitor in person. There, seated across a heavy oak desk, he learned the truth. Eleanor had taken control of the estate in his absence, restructured its debts, repaired the tenant farms, and earned the loyalty of everyone who worked the land. The solicitor spoke of her with clear admiration, nodding that the estate had not been in such healthy condition in years. Alastair sat in stunned silence. He had expected to return to a struggling household desperate for his guidance, a place where his absence would have caused ruin, making his return all the more necessary. Instead, he learned that the household not only survived without him, it had flourished. His pride, already bruised by Camille's departure, cracked further under this new revelation. That night, in a small rented room above a tailor's shop, Alistair stared at his own reflection in a cracked mirror and barely recognized the man looking back at him. Everything he had sacrificed his marriage for had crumbled to nothing, while the wife he abandoned had built something real from the pieces he left behind. For the first time since leaving, he considered the possibility that returning home might mean facing consequences far worse than empty pockets. The carriage wheels crunched over gravel that had once been full of ruts and holes, and Alistair noticed immediately how smooth the drive had become. He leaned out the window as the manor came into view, and his breath caught at what he saw. Fresh paint covered the once peeling shutters. New fencing lined the pastures where thin, sickly cattle used to graze, replaced now by strong, healthy animals grazing peacefully. Workers moved briskly across the fields, nodding respectfully to the carriage as it passed, though their eyes carried curiosity rather than warmth. Alina stood on the front steps as the carriage rolled to a stop, dressed simply but with an unmistakable air of authority Alistair had never seen in her before. She did not rush forward to greet him, nor did she turn away. She simply waited, calm and composed, as he stepped down and approached her. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words he had rehearsed on the long journey home suddenly felt hollow and inadequate. Alina greeted him with polite formality, the kind reserved for a distant relative rather than a husband returning after nearly a year away. She invited him inside, where he found the study transformed, organized ledgers stacked neatly on shelves that had once held only dust and disorder. Julian appeared briefly to greet him, and Alistair noticed the easy familiarity between Julian and Alina, a partnership built through months of shared work and mutual respect that Alistair had played no part in creating. Over dinner that evening, Alistair attempted to reclaim some sense of authority, suggesting changes to the very systems Alina had built. She listened politely, then explained, without hostility but without hesitation, why each of his suggestions would undo months of careful progress. The staff, who once would have deferred instantly to the Duke's word, now glanced toward Alina for confirmation before acting on anything he requested. Alistair walked the grounds the following morning, seeking some corner of the estate where his presence still mattered, some decision still waiting for his approval. He found none. The tenants greeted him with cautious politeness, but it was Alina's name they spoke with genuine warmth, Alina's judgment they trusted when disputes arose, Alina's leadership that had carried them through the hardest months of the year. He sought Julian out privately, hoping to find an ally who might help him regain his footing, but Julian spoke only of Alina's decisions, her vision for the estate's future, her steady hand during the crisis Alistair himself had caused. There was no cruelty in Julian's words, only plain truth, and that truth stung far worse than any insult could have. By the end of that first week home, Alistair understood with growing dread that the home he returned to was no longer the one he had left. He had imagined his return as a triumphant reclaiming of his rightful place, but instead he found himself a guest in his own house, tolerated out of duty rather than welcomed out of love. Alina had not merely survived his absence. She had replaced him entirely in every way that mattered, and Alistair had no idea how to undo what he had allowed to happen. Alistair found Alina in the study late one evening, the same room where she had first opened the ledgers on the night he abandoned her. He closed the door behind him and asked, with more humility than he had ever shown before, whether there was any way to repair what had broken between them. Alina set down her pen and looked at him steadily, without anger, without tears, only a quiet clarity that unsettled him more than any outburst could have. She told him plainly that his choices had cost him far more than a single mistake could explain away. He had not only broken her trust, he had broken the trust of every tenant who depended on the estate, every worker who once believed in the Whitmore name. She reminded him that while he pursued a woman who abandoned him the moment his fortune faltered, she had spent every day rebuilding what he nearly destroyed, earning respect he had never bothered to earn for himself. Alistair argued that he was still her husband, that surely some part of their old life could be salvaged. Alina answered that titles and vows meant little when one partner treated the other as an afterthought. She explained, calmly and firmly, that she had already consulted with solicitors of her own, arranging matters, so that she could pursue a formal separation without losing the security she had built with her own hands. She would not be left destitute or dependent, not this time, not ever again. Alistair sat in stunned silence, realizing that the woman before him held all the power in the room, power she had earned through months of relentless work while he chased fleeting pleasure abroad. He tried once more to appeal to whatever affection might remain, but Alina's expression did not soften. She told him that respect, once lost, could not simply be requested back through soft words and late apologies. The following morning, Alina rose early, dressed for the fields rather than for any performance of grief or reconciliation. Julian waited by the stables, ready to accompany her on the daily inspection of the harvest, a routine they had shared through every season of the past year. Alistair watched from an upstairs window as the two of them rode out together, laughing quietly about something he could not hear, moving through the estate with the easy confidence of people who belonged exactly where they stood. He remained in the manor alone, surrounded by the very improvements Alina had made possible, in a house that ran perfectly well without his guidance. The staff carried out their duties efficiently around him, polite but distant, treating him as a resident rather than a master. For the first time, Alistair understood fully what he had thrown away the night he chose Camille's company over his own wife's devotion. Some choices, he realized too late, could never be undone, no matter how sincerely one wished to reverse them. He had returned home expecting to reclaim everything he once possessed, only to discover that everything worth keeping had already slipped beyond his reach, rebuilt by hands he had once dismissed as unworthy of real power.